Good evening, everybody. Those in the room and those on Zoom, thank you very much for coming. We're very excited about the fact that we can actually, come on in, we can actually meet at the school again, although we're hoping that we can work out the wrinkles of this thing as we go on, but we're very, very pleased to both be teaching live and holding events live again. I want to thank Theo and Diane for their kindness in joining us today. Everybody, I hope, has received the announcement of our season of ADR CLE events. We'll be having the Diversity Symposium again in January. We'll be having the arbitration again in April. And come on in. Our next event is on the 19th of October. And we'll be talking about investor state international arbitration, which is an area that is pretty hot now. We have Barry Appleton from Toronto and Wolf von Kumberg from London, and Isabel Manathiordi, who is just recently graduated from New York Law School, and she's going to be with us as well. Everybody will be getting an announcement of that. My sense is we'll probably do that totally on Zoom since we have the London people coming in, but we'll make that decision and let you know. Okay, well, thank you both again, and
Thank you.
Off you go.
Okay. Share the screen. This works well. Well, hopefully everyone can see that. We're sharing our PowerPoint together. My name is Theo Cheng. I'm joined by Diane Rosen. Let us give you a quick introduction to ourselves, and then we'll dive into our program. I am an independent full-time arbitrator and mediator after having spent 20 years or more in commercial and intellectual property litigation. I focus my ADR work on commercial intellectual property, technology, entertainment, and employment cases. I'm also a very happy member of the faculty here at New York Law School as an adjunct professor, where I teach a ADR survey course, which covers the basics of negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, as well as a domestic arbitration course during the school's January intersession.
Okay, hi everybody. So I am a practicing lawyer and practicing mediator, but I have a whole other part of my life in adult learning, where I am a doctoral candidate at Teachers College, Columbia, getting my degree in adult learning and leadership, and my dissertation is on well-being among big law partners. Don't laugh. There is well-being there. And I know Theo, we've worked together in the past, and just really delighted to be here and give you kind of a different thinking about some of the ways we look at ADR, and as practitioners, maybe learn some new.
Great. All right. So I think we're going to start with a little icebreaker, which we've so appropriately named Chris and Pat. So let's go over that fact pattern. I'll read Chris's story for you so that you all can all follow it. So Chris posted a notice at work stating that their car was for sale for a price of $8,000. Pat approached Chris about buying the car. At first, Chris was reluctant to sell it to Pat because Pat was a colleague and a good friend. Chris was concerned that if something went wrong with the deal, it would harm their friendship. Chris told Pat about various things that were wrong with the car, including a defective parking brake and a broken radio. Nevertheless, Pat purchased the car for the advertised price of $8,000.
And here's Pat's story. Pat seemed extremely happy with the car on the date of the sale. 2 weeks later, Pat called Chris to say that the car was unsafe because of a faulty exhaust system, and it was going to cost about $1,100 to repair. Pat wanted to return the car for a full refund. At the time of the sale, Chris was unaware of any problems with the car's exhaust system. Chris initially said, okay, but the next day, Chris changed their mind, as Chris had already spent the money from the sale on new kitchen appliances and some much needed home repairs. So these are the questions that we'd like you all to think about, and we're going to do some.
Yeah, we're
breakout
gonna
rooms.
break you up into groups. So in the room here, well, we have the three of you be in one group, right? And the three of you be in another group to just caucus about these questions that you see on the screen.
Yep.
And the phantom IT person who's in the background, if I could ask you to place these some of the folks, and we look like we have about 87 to 90 people in the on the Zoom. So maybe perhaps break them up into about 16 or 18 groups and have them discuss this for about what, 10, 12 minutes?
10, 12 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and we'll hear what you all came to think about all of this.
Okay, all right, I think everyone's back. Apologies again for the technical snafus, but let's do this. Let's have the two groups here in person report out what your sort of brainstorming brought to light, and then we'll go to some folks online and hear what they have to say. Who wants to start?
Sure.
I think we have a
Go ahead. We got a group to the left here. I know you can't see them, but
Nominated,
So
self-nominated.
we sort of made an assumption that the social component was very important to Chris.
Mhm.
While Pat, by asking for all of the money back and to rescind the deal, had already chosen to prioritize financial over the social.
Mhm.
Not that the social wouldn't play a role, but that's sort of where we looked at the parties' positions. And then we had a discussion around whether Chris might, we certainly could see him end at I will pay for the repairs to put you back in the position you thought you would be in when you bought it. But thought maybe sort of hard to tell how we might balance out the social risk of the social by saying I'll split the difference as an opening position. So
Okay.
we also thought that maybe they would just torch the car and split the insurance.
Very modern result.
very creative. very
Okay.
creative.
How about
All
you
right.
all?
You guys in New York are famous for that.
Right, you guys.
Did something similar overall. I think the social
Speak a
aspect.
little louder so that they can hear you out in the world.
We said something similar overall. We said that the social aspect would definitely be important to Chris, but I think the financial aspect also will be, depending on what the deal ends up being. He obviously spent all his money on a new kitchen, so a full refund is something that's probably not in the works, but $1,100 compared to the $8,000 that he sold the car for, something he'd be more considerable.
Okay.
Okay, about somebody online, anybody have something different that they talked about in one of your groups? Want to contribute?
A video. I'll go. This is Cindy. I think my video's on.
Okay.
We came at it from a little bit different point of view. We had trouble figuring out. I mean, we knew what that Pat wanted to cancel the deal. And Chris's was wanting to preserve the sale and the friendship, but
Concentrated and just breathing in that can then damage your lung.
we thought that that for Chris to make an offer of either 1,100 or maybe even sweeten it by another 4 to bring it to an even 15, just to say, you know, I didn't know this. And he leads off with, I didn't know this. I will try to make it right with you to split the repairs and even pay a little more if there's something extra, but I've already spent the money. I cannot refund it to you. Because I think that, you know, Pat knows that it was an as-is purchase, and that's going to be an uphill battle. And so I think, to me, I felt there was an emotional aspect of she felt her friend knew and pulled the wool over her eyes. And if that's explained that actually he really didn't, and he's offering to make it right, I didn't take it that financial was the priority. I took it that the emotional aspect of feeling she'd been duped by a friend. And so that's kind of where we ended up.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, this is Richard Lutrier. I don't remember the words "as is" being in the facts. Maybe I can't see them again. But if they weren't there, then you're subject to all the UCC warranties of, you know, that it was merchantable, all the things that are there. So I think it wasn't really clear to both parties probably what they were getting themselves into. On the other hand, even if you put a new exhaust system in, if you buy a 10-year-old car, you buy a 10-year-old exhaust system. So its owner shouldn't have to put a new one in. So I think some kind of adjustment, like 50% of the cost, should be acceptable.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more?
Sure. Anybody else online?
UCC warranties. Uh-huh.
Yeah. There's no warranty of merchantability or anything like that. 314, 315,
Okay,
or fitness for a particular purpose. That's the two classic ones. I think it's 2-314, 2-315.
okay.
All right, no,
Okay.
sorry. So what's most interesting to me about this fact pattern is a number of things that you were all saying, right? To me, I heard a lot of assumptions about things that were not in the actual fact pattern that we provided, right? And you took the time in your groups to fill in the gaps, right? With certain other information that we had not provided to you.
Right, about motives, feelings about the situation, what they want, what either party wanted to preserve. In this room, we heard a he, and it could have been a Chris or Pat, could be a she. We don't know. They're gender neutral names. So what this really illustrates, and unfortunately we can't be together because it gets a lot more raucous, is that when we come into a mediation, there's a story. Everybody has a story, but we don't really know what's behind the story. And we use the time in mediation to draw out the stories. However, whatever people are saying, we as human beings can't help but fill in the gaps based on our own life and experience and what we believe to be true about perhaps even the human condition. Right there?
That's exactly right. And that's a natural thing that we all do. And for those of us who actually practice as mediators, it's even more important that we are on guard for that, right? Because it's one thing for the parties to do that, and maybe we as mediators can sit back and help them realize that. But if we're doing it ourselves, then we're making assumptions, filling in facts without asking the right questions as we go along. And that may color very much the kinds of things we do in the mediation groups.
Right, our choices as mediators.
Could you give an example of the gap fillers that some people use? Because I'm not sure that I heard them when they happened.
So this group here was talking about what's very important to Chris. Or one had the social thing and one was the more financial thing. We may not know that. Chris may have thought that in the beginning and just like, I spent the money, done, we're done. We don't know what's
And
going
in specific, I think I heard you say that, you believe that Chris had prioritized, I think that's the word you used, prioritize, right? The money, right, over the relationship, because in fact, the money had been spent already, right?
And so
But we don't really know that. You inferred that from the fact that he's already spent the money on the appliances.
right. But may actually be feeling terrible and trying to figure out how can I raise the money to pay it back. Again, we're filling in the blanks only because that's what people do. And what this illustrates is with only a handful of sentences, we brought to the story a lot of stuff that wasn't actually in the story. And so that's leading us into how do adults process information? That's what we're going to talk about. Nothing's working.
There's nothing working.
Everything's
Why
stuck.
is it working now? Oh, come on.
Oh, boy.
That's weird.
Okay, sorry, guys. We're having like so much fun playing with this
Playing
toy.
with Peter's laptop. Not even-
There we go. So what we're talking about tonight is the idea about getting to maybe. So in a lot of people who study dispute resolution, conflict, talk about the win-win, the win-lose, the lose-lose. And what I want to suggest, and what we're going to talk about here is that maybe there's something in between. Maybe instead of focusing on the end point, we spend more time thinking about the process. And what is the process? Maybe. Once we can begin to have parties think about maybe, then we open the door to potential pathways to resolution.
Okay. All right, so illustrative of that point, right?
So in ADR, you have to have a sense of humor.
Win with this.
There we go.
Ah.
Okay.
Your keys are sticky here. That's what it is.
Oh, it's my fault, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So take a look at this slide, right? For those of you who don't remember your Roman numerals, right? It's 1 + 11 = 10. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If I left this slide with you for a while, you're probably going to think hard about why would I put up something like this? Try and think maybe there's a trick, maybe there's a typo somewhere, and you'll try and figure it out. But it all takes a moment just to think about what point of view you're coming at the problem with, right? So, and maybe this is something you've seen before, but all you have to do is turn the equation upside down, and what do you have? You have 10 = 9 + 1, right? This is a very simplistic problem, but the point is that it all depended on your viewpoint, right? So, and another really good example, which we don't have and then just remembered it now, is John Barkai has an article in a law review article in which he has a bunch of characters that look a lot like a bunch of hieroglyphics. But if you turn your head 90 degrees, it says something else. And all you had to do was turn and change your viewpoint. So illustrative of that is this cartoon, which I actually do use sometimes in a mediation setting. I actually use this to illustrate what I mean when I'm trying to explain why one party really isn't understanding where the other party is coming from, right? So these are two gentlemen looking at a figure on the sidewalk. One person obviously thinks it's a 6, the other one thinks it's a 9, but just because you think you're right doesn't mean that I'm wrong, right? Because you may simply not be viewing things from the same perspective or the same lens.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I want to take a moment here to talk about words, because as mediators, we are constantly, you're looking at me puzzled, like.
No, I'm learning. This is what happens when I'm
I thought I
learning.
was saying something wrong.
Learning looks like this.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about words, because words are so incredibly important, right? As mediators, we are very careful about the words we use. Well, no, this laptop's on mute so that we don't have feedback.
Sorry, guys.
Right, so we want to make sure that we are very careful about the words we use, because the words we use have an impact on the listener, right? Now, the average person speaks somewhere between 125 and 150 words per minute. If you know Dan White's from the New York court system, he speaks probably twice that rate. This is a very fast talker. But the important thing to remember about words and listening is this: we retain approximately 10% of what we visually see. Okay, so if you're just looking at animation or motion picture or something that's broadcast without sound, 10% of what we see is what we retain. If you add in what you hear, you're going to retain 30 to 40%. So just by adding in the soundtrack, you're increasing your retention by 3 to 4 times. Then if we add in doing action, you're actually going to retain 90% of it, right? So this is why, as students, right, that we tell this to our students here, we tell students to make sure to take notes on what the professor says, because then you're seeing the professor talk, you're hearing the sound, you're hearing the visual that the professor might be showing, and you're taking notes down. You're doing some action to help reinforce, right? That's why note-taking is so critical, is for arbitrators, right, who are trying to follow the evidence and the testimony. It's critical for mediators to make sure that you are accurate in what you are hearing and conveying it. I tell people in mediation, the worst thing I can do in a mediation and caucusing is to play a very bad game of telephone where I don't take good notes, right? Now, here's what's interesting though. Within an hour, within just 1 hour, people forget 50% of what they heard. When I first learned that, I was astonished. Astonished, but also not so surprised, because an hour later, after I left the room and I come back in, it seems like the people in that room have totally forgotten all the wonderful things I had spent time talking to them about, because they've forgotten 50% of it. After a day goes by, so imagine a mediation that lasts more than a day, you're coming back for a second session. They've already forgotten 70% on average of what they heard, okay? This would counsel for why momentum is so important in mediation and why it's very important to do recaps at the beginning of the second day, right? This is the way people learn, and this is the way people retain information. And certainly after a week, they have forgotten 90% of any new information they have learned, right? In a different presentation, I talk about why I only do mediators proposals now in writing. And there are many, many reasons I do that, but one of the reasons I do them in writing is for the retention value. The retention value is so critical, because when we are trained as mediators in that basic 40-hour training, and we go and deliver a mediator's proposals the way we're taught in those trainings, we typically do it orally. And what happens? An hour later, they've forgotten 50% of the terms and conditions. Maybe they've written it down, maybe they haven't. But even if they wrote it down, maybe they didn't even write it down correctly. Certainly a day later, they don't retain even more, and certainly a week later, they won't. So it's very important for me, especially in the kind of mediations I do where there are multiple terms and conditions, not just a unidimensional negotiation, that I have something in writing that I can present to them, that they can take back with them and can refer to over and over again. Finally, I just want to say, you've probably seen these kinds of statistics before, but the way in which human beings give and get information is really critical to remember, right? 55% of it is visual in nature. 38% is vocal, and 7% is verbal.
And I just want to add
Yeah.
in that in the vocal, and we learn this in a lot of mediation trainings, this is about body language, cadence, volume, speed, velocity of words. And so although there are words and we understand the words, how are those words coming out? What's going on with the person? So we talk about watching, listening with all our senses. This chart really shows you how critical it is that you be listening in a lot of different ways.
Finally, before I turn it back over to Diane, I just want to make what may seem like a very simple statement, that words don't mean the same thing to everyone. On some trivial level, this could simply be a lexicon issue, right? You're just different words and different meanings or different jargon. But on another level, a much more subtle level, what you intend to convey may be very, very different using the words that you think you're using than what is being perceived by the listener, right? So communication, how you communicate, what you communicate may be very, very different depending on how it's perceived and processed. Right.
So let's take this back to our topic of the evening about conflict resolution. I happen to like this definition of conflict because it really talks about a lot of different elements of the conflict, the goals, the rewards, the interference, and basically, in order to resolve a conflict, we have to figure out shifting a perspective to reach a result, so that all things considered, a party's position is advanced sufficiently to be net positive. And to do that, they have to address their interests, and they have to decide what's positive. Both of those things, by the way, are highly subjective, personal, and relative, which adds another layer of complication to, well, we thought we were getting someplace, but when somebody goes back and thinks about a proposal, a mediator's proposal, or something on the table, now that they're thinking about it, not so much. And that's where we get into all kinds of confusion. And so we're going to now turn to, well, how do we shift those perspectives in a valuable way that can move a conflict forward toward resolution? I really love this quote, kind of from an unexpected source, about we don't see things as they are, but as we are. And therefore, in order to shift a perspective, we actually have to learn and relearn. So what is learning anyway? There's different kinds of learning. There's the abstract knowledge. We think of that as substantive. And then there's the knowing in practice. That's what we do. That's the experience that we're having from which we take away lessons, data, information. So there's different kinds of knowing. These are the ones that scholars talk about: experiences, presentational, propositional, and practical. So there's abstract concepts, there are things we learn from doing, and circling back to what we were talking about how you retain information, the doing plus the listening plus the seeing really reinforces your learning, and therefore there's elements to your learning that are both cognitive and somatic. Kolb learning cycle. This is a very common model for how people think about learning, and it's about learning from experience. So it's a cycle, but it also is, a lot of models tend to be cycles, but in real life, things tend to loop around and jump around from place to place. But the basic cycle is there's an experience, then I reflect on it, then I draw concepts from it, and then I take what I did from all of that and I try something. And what I try becomes the next concrete experience. So in this model, you're looking at about doing, reflecting, doing, reflecting. It goes round and round and round. And what is relevant here is that people tend to favor one aspect over the other of this cycle more often than not. This is not to say that everybody does the same thing all the time, but some people are more focused on the action and some people are more focused on the reflection. And some people like to really focus on the experience itself, and lawyers in particular happen to love the abstract conceptualization, because as lawyers, that's what we're taught to do, is to pull issues from listening to a story, issue spot, and then draw conclusions. So another model of learning that is very important in the field of adult learning is this idea of transformational learning. So Jack Mesereau was the pioneer of this theory. And if you follow the steps, it makes a lot of sense. Something happens that has disoriented. So I gotta say, well, what does that mean? And then I try to assess that critically. Then I say, oh, let me explore some more. And then I'm going to say, what am I going to do with that? And then I maybe try to learn a few more things. And then I build on that and build on that. And then I reintegrate that information into another level of my learning, which, by the way, may trigger another disorder. Another element of adult learning that's really important is how we manage levels of uncertainty. So there are different things that we know and don't know. So sometimes we pretty much know what's going to happen. Then, yeah, maybe there's a couple of different choices, but we have a pretty good sense of both of those choices and can lean in a direction. When we get to level 3, now there's a lot of things and a lot of variables, and we're really actually not sure what anything means. And when we get to level 4, it becomes so ambiguous that we can't actually make a prediction. Now, with these levels, for most people come increasing levels of anxiety, disorientation, and ambivalence about how they're going to act. Why does this matter? When you're dealing with parties in a conflict, whether as an advocate or as a neutral, you kind of want to read the room and say, where are these parties? Are they overwhelmed that they can't figure out how they're going to parse out all these different possibilities? Or they seem pretty clear and they understand what's going on? When you have kind of somebody in a level 1 and somebody in a level 4, it is going to be a very protracted conversation to make some progress on resolving your conflict.
Just interject for a second.
Please.
What I really love about this concept that you're talking about is that it actually melds for me two concepts. One is that I've always said that uncertainty drives settlement. It
Mhm.
just does, because when you're uncertain about what's going to happen, that's when you think about resolution and early resolution as a way to resolve or get rid of that uncertainty.
That's
But
right.
at the same time, you also said that as you go from level 1 to 4, your anxiety increases. That reinforces for me the notion that in every conflict or dispute, there's always going to be an emotional component to that
Absolutely.
dispute. And that emotional component could come from uncertainty as opposed to anger or frustration at the other party. And so I think as mediators, I mean, maybe you'll agree with me, you need to deal with that
Correct.
in some
Yes.
ways first, before
Exactly.
you get to trying to figure out what the rational decision might be.
Right, and
Right.
that's what I'm talking about with reading the rooms. Many people who've taken a conflict resolution course or training of some sort has seen the image of an iceberg. And we talk about positions and interests, and what's above the water is your position and what's below the water are your interests. Well, sometimes the interests are actually even invisible to the person. So they know 100%, this is my position, I gotta have this, or I'm not settling, but they don't really know why. And some of that why goes back to, have they drawn conclusions? How disorienting is the dilemma? And what's their level of uncertainty about the situation that's going to draw them to either take their anxiety and say, no, I want to settle, or take their anxiety and say, I can never settle because there's too many choices. Which takes us to this question of rational decision making. So we, particularly as lawyers, consider ourselves to be thoughtful, rational decision makers. But actually the science of how our brain works has told us that we are actually not really good at this. We being everybody who's a human, right? We have our brain, there's a part of our brain that's very anxious, but there's a part of our brain that's very curious. So the same episode can trigger anxiety or curiosity or some combination. We tend to make really bad assumptions and predictions, and we're not very good at sorting. Why? Because a million pieces of information, data points are coming at us in any given moment. And when that is happening, we're in a nanosecond. We're trying to decide what that means. What's going to stick with us? What do we really think is going to make us satisfied at the end? And I know that everybody who's mediated a case has had parties come back after you think you're settled and you're getting ready for the next session. They go, you know, I thought about it. That's not what I want. And you sit there and say, okay, so we're going to just do those 12 hours, but okay. But it's because we're not good at predicting or sorting. And by the way, all that information coming at us 24/7 is incomplete and possibly inaccurate. Then we get to, are we going by the gut or are we going by the brain? A lot of people say, go with my gut. Well, your intuition is not always really smart, just saying. Sometimes your intuition is right on, spot on. You know you're in a dangerous situation. Sometimes your intuition is so convoluted by your bad assumptions and your biases and your perception gaps that you're not actually intuitively making a good choice for yourself. And then there's looking at the subjective and the objective, and there are too many options. So a scholar, Barry Schwartz, wrote a really wonderful article called The Tyranny of Choice, which is when we have too many options, we kind of break down. It's like the kid in the candy store. They're told they can get a piece of candy, and then they're so worked up that they end up having a tantrum and they have to leave because there are too many choices, right? So what does all of that mean? Well, we've all been familiar probably with this ladder of inference, which I can't get to today. I'm gonna get to it. Many people are very familiar with this. This is somewhat like the cycle of learning. You know, something happens, we filter it, we make assumptions, we draw conclusions, and we develop beliefs, and then we act on all of that, and then the cycle begins again. So there's, you know, some people call this single loop learning, some people call it double loop learning. But the idea is, with whatever is going on, we have to make meaning of the information that came our way, because that's what learning is. learning is making meaning from data that is coming at us or that we are absorbing, we have to turn it into something from which we can draw meaning. And that brings us to this other thing. This is one of my favorite ideas in adult learning, the Johari learning window. And so it's a simple matrix, but this is so critical in conflict resolution because again, like reading people's levels of uncertainty, as a neutral, we're also looking at where are the parties on this matrix? I know, and you know the same thing. Cool. I don't know, and neither do you, also clear. But those blind spots and hidden areas become very complicated because that's when people get into all kind of tactical negotiations and trying to game the negotiation. So we got all these theories. We've got uncertainty, we've got the inference ladder, we've got making meaning. Well, what do we do and how does that matter to us in connection with conflict resolution? People need to make meaning of new information. As parties reveal their positions, as parties say words out loud, new information is coming and the parties are going to have to make meaning of it in a way that matters to them. And so my belief is that rather than trying to convince somebody to agree with the other person, open the door a little bit to challenge, well, what does that person know? What do they think they know? And activate the process of making meaning, which we can do very deliberately and intentionally, and create opportunities for parties to imagine possible solutions, see other alternatives, to consider possibilities that had not previously been on their radar.
Okay, all right, so with that, we are going to put some of the things we just talked about this evening to another hypothetical set of facts. We'll read this out loud, just make sure everyone follows it. And this time we won't break out into breakout rooms. We'll just let you all work together in groups of your own. So first, Sam works at XYZ Corporation in a mid-level supervisory role. Sam reports directly to an executive vice president and has 3 direct reports. Last week, Sam was notified of a change in job assignment. The role involves a move to a different team and will now report to a vice president and will no longer have any direct reports. Management says that this change has been due to a corporate reorganization and reallocation of resources. Sam's position is still considered to be at the same level and responsibility, essentially a lateral move. Sam sees the change as a demotion and a lack of recognition for contributions and to the business and acknowledgement of managerial competence. Here's the question for the group. How can XYZ leaders and Sam make sense of this? All right, so let's take a few minutes. Those in the room, you can break out into the groups you were in before. Those online, either chat amongst yourselves, find others to chat in the Zoom. I think we don't want to sort of risk the breakout room scenario again. So
Because we may never see you again. And we want to see you again.
And
Release here from us.
one of the
Release here from us.
online people has very kindly reminded us of the need for online folks to have a code word. So the first code word for the online people will be Theo, T-H-E-O, Theo.
You don't need it, right?
You don't have to worry about it because you're clearly present.
He signed
You
in.
sign in and sign out, right?
We can't leave the room.
how creative, Peter.
Well, that's one of my strengths,
Really?
creativity.
All
All
right,
right.
which we give him like about
Yeah.
12 minutes. Oh, yeah, I can change that. Yeah, we can.
And then we can also.
Gallery view. We can also check the chat out.
Focusing on what we have to say.
Hi, this is Mary Sue. Are you going into breakout rooms now?
No,
We are not going to use the breakout rooms only because we had such great success with them last time. So we're just going to have you chat amongst yourselves on the Zoom
chat
line
feature.
or on the chat.
Or
Okay.
or speak out, because we're here and happy to have a conversation about it. So with those of you who are physically in this room, so how might you think about helping these parties make sense? They are in polar different places about what has happened to them.
Can you bring the screen back up?
Yeah, sure. Oh, no. It's not good. Want to bring the fact pattern back up, you say?
Wonder if the people would like to refer to.
Oh, sure.
Sure. Let's hope this works.
Yes.
There we go.
So any thoughts in here?
Yeah, trying to maybe clarify the motivation behind the promotion.
The code is Theo, it's THEO. And I bet that you can put a little bit of money on what the second code might be, but the first code is Theo.
So
Yeah, like trying to understand what the motivation behind the promotion is in terms of, the company's perspective, and trying to have the company sort of convey that message to Sam.
okay, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think they have to, the company has to understand Sam's perspective.
Right.
And
How would they do that?
well, they're taking certain responsibilities away from him since he previously was doing reports and now he's not doing reports. So they have to understand that if someone has assigned duties and then suddenly is being told you no longer will have those assigned duties, that there's going to be a perception I'm having certain responsibilities removed.
Right.
So if there's a reason why he no longer needs to do these reports, that should be explained. There should maybe be some corollary responsibilities showing that this is in fact a lateral move and that his input is still responsible to X, Y, Z. So instead of giving 3 written reports, he will report to a supervisor.
Yeah.
Also, because one's status within any corporation is also dependent on how one is perceived. If there's titles or other
Right.
nomenclature, like VP for
Executive
squad.
VP or senior VP.
Exactly.
Or
So-
assistant VP or.
Which is why with some corporations, they seem to have 600 VP.
Right.
But so they need to maintain the status quo by giving him a title that's commensurate with his level of.
Right.
They need to also have the aspects of respect and status that he had previously. And that would also involve if he has a C-suite or he has a corner office or, and I've seen this, it makes a big difference if somebody moves from a smaller cubicle, even if it's 2 feet smaller, is going to be
Feel diminished.
right. So all these factors, and again, as you're pointing out, in any kind of hierarchical situation, people are going to look at affronts that may seem insignificant.
Right.
And so XYZ has to be cognizant of those affronts or
Right.
what are looked at as demotions, and then has to have commensurate ways of giving status and whatever.
Right. Well, so in here, listening to you talk about that, a thought for me is they have to figure out what matters to Sam,
Sure.
right? So his salary is not being changed, that's okay.
Right.
He's losing reports, maybe that is what's bothering him.
Right.
He may be reassigned in terms of the actual content of his job. So step one, going back into those levels of uncertainty and where Sam might be in the learning cycle, or where Sam may be in the Johari learning window of what he knows or doesn't know, is the question of what matters to Sam and how do you find that out? Like, you actually have to ask, right? We've all learned the hard way I'm raising my hand on that, that assumptions tend not to be terribly accurate. And so getting to the heart of what matters to somebody actually involves dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just repeat a couple of things that are in the chat. Someone that echoed what you said, I think it's Aaron Albert who said, Sam needs a reason why management thinks this is a lateral move.
Yes.
Externals we were given don't make it sound that way.
Right.
But the fact that that person who wrote that thinks it didn't sound that way is because of the facts that are provided and certain assumptions and inferences made from those facts.
Yep.
Now, there's another comment that goes to the digging deeper into the question, just getting through here. Are there standards of comparison that may be drawn with other employees who are in a position similar to Sam, going through the same experience? So these are actual questions that might be posed, right, either to the XYZ Corporation or to Sam to see if there are what employment attorneys call comparators, right? To see if that is a fact worth exploring in a meeting.
Right. And, you know, going back to what words mean to people, we have to really do a deep dive into what did all of this mean to Sam? What did it mean? You know, he thinks it's a demotion. Demotion is a pretty loaded word, right? And he thinks he's unappreciated and nobody's acknowledging his contributions. So part of the conversation has to be about, well, here's the contributions that we do recognize, and we actually consider this an upgrade in a certain way. But again, we have to get into the heart, soul, and mind of the other person to try to understand what that looks like. And that requires some very thoughtful and intentional communication, really deliberate in having those conversations. So if Sam got this announcement in an email, like F-, right?
I agree. I mean, that's just not the right way to communicate. If you want to maintain relationships with your employees, deliver that kind of information, because email is just not that kind of.
Right. And so if we were in a mediation or an arbitration about this, I suppose more in the nature of a mediation, not so much about evidence, but in trying to think about how to have the parties hear the other party's version of the story, we would be having to look at some very artful questions to get to the heart of why the company thought this was not a bad thing and why Sam believes it is a bad thing. And remember, going back to that, you know, are we rational decision makers? And the answer is not so much. Which part of that is where Sam is not making a rational decision? Does he feel less than among his peers? Is that what's making him feel bad? Is he going to be moved to a different part of the building and he's going to lose his work buddies? Is that what makes him feel bad? We don't.
Or his parking space.
Or his parking space.
Or his
correct?
parking space.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, someone else writes in the chats, there has to be honest and difficult conversations that really address Sam's strengths and weaknesses. Leaders have to treasure Sam leaders have to reassure Sam of the transparency of the process. And I think that's right.
Right. And then let's put a wrench in it and say, maybe the company doesn't really care. Right? Maybe Sam isn't valued, right? We're assuming that they want to say, no, this was, you know, lateral move, it's all super good and you're fine. Well, maybe they actually don't care. Again, we don't know. You know, they may be, you know what, Sam, we're putting you over there because, you know, it wasn't working out so well with you in the job that you had. And this is a better role for you to serve our business purposes. So again, that's a communication issue, not to say, Sam, you know, like you're not great, but Sam, we're reorienting your job for these reasons. And, you know, one of the things that that neuroscience has taught us is that people are not necessarily convinced by factual arguments. Facts are not necessarily compelling in somebody's decision, right? and everybody probably can think of a personal experience where they understood what was happening, but like it didn't make them feel better in any way whatsoever. And so that's another piece of the puzzle is where's the person's emotional landscape in the face of this conflict, and understanding that as a way to figure out how to move things. Again, both people have to make sense of this change to themselves and to the other people, right? Because maybe the manager thought, hey, this is like a really great thing. I don't get why Sam's unhappy. This is great. But they don't.
Question. If I may ask a question?
And doesn't see that. Yeah.
Yeah, go
When
ahead.
do you bring in your law firm to do one of those investigations to see just what the devil's going on? If age is a factor, race, sex, religion, national origin. I don't know if you all remember, there was a Supreme Court case a few years ago where the person had the same salary, but they were now, and I'm going to make this up because I don't remember the exact details, they were cleaning toilets on the basement rather than the toilets for the executives, which were a lot cleaner. Using that as an obscure, we call it a absurd example, but it was something along those lines. Person had everything the same, except they were now doing something somewhere else. And that went up to the Supreme Court. And the reason because the Supreme Court looked at it was people's perception of the change was negative. That person was no longer considered valuable to other departments, whether they would ever consider accepting a transfer from that person, because he had already been marked with the mark of, was it mark of Cain on his forehead because of whatever happened in that job that he didn't I would say measure up to stay in that position. They had to transfer him somewhere else.
Right. So your point is really important, and what it really brings home is where in the dispute are we? Is Sam just feeling sad in Sam's office, looking sad? Or is this now elevating to a higher level conflict and a complaint and a discrimination case? So where we are in the conflict cycle will also have an impact on how deeply we're going into how the other person feels.
All right. Should we open it up to other questions?
Yes,
Let's do
please,
that.
please. So thank you, everybody, for all these ideas. They're great.
Code number 2,
Oh, yes, code number 2.
Diane,
C'est moi.
Surprise.
what a surprise. One N, if you put in 2 N's, then you don't get credit.
So comments, questions, reactions to what you heard
Thoughts?
today?
I actually had a question. You have convinced me of the need to inquire about issues that are nuanced and often overlooked.
Mhm.
The trouble is, if you asked Sam what's important to you, I don't think that you could rely on her answer. Could you?
Well, so I come out of having studied positive psychology, which is a real thing, everybody. And one of the things about positive psychology is coming at those kinds of questions from a positive perspective as opposed to a negative. And there's actually a whole science of something called appreciative inquiry, which asks questions in a positive way. So rather than asking Sam what's bad, I might ask Sam, if this job were amazing, tell me what it looks like. Tell me if you could have anything you want out of your role. Tell me what your top 5 things are. And that would help me, and that would help me begin to parse out what matters to Sam.
I'm just being more and more skeptical that Sam knows what she wants.
Sam
Or that
may or may
Sam,
not.
you know what I mean? And
Right. But that
the
dialogue,
problem is her own lack of clarity.
right, but dialogue can start bringing that out by imagining the future, right?
That's one technique, and I agree with that. I'm not trained in positive psychology, but I would say that I wouldn't even ask that question, like what is important to you? It almost like frames it in a way that makes it very difficult for the receiver.
Might get
to
very
put-
defensive.
Right, to put things in that bucket for you, right? That's what you want at the end of the day. You want to know what's important to Sam. but to open up a dialogue with Sam, to talk about the things, the aspects of the job. Maybe you frame it the way Diane did it, but there are other ways too. Just ask questions that highlight the things that Sam likes about the job or doesn't like about the job, and then start funneling down, right? And start saying, so it sounds like what you're saying is you really like this aspect of the job. So that's kind of important to you, right? You know, and then you kind of drill down, I think.
Right. And, neutrals are well known for the open-ended question,
Yes. Yes.
which allows the party to start speaking. And sometimes it comes out as a word salad, but if you're listening carefully, you can find the bits, start directing the questions to get deeper and drill down, as Theo said.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I observe in some of the negotiations watch is that students who are trying to either mediate or participate in those exercises want to know obviously what the other side's interests or what their own concerns are. And then they'll ask the direct question. So what's your interest? What's your concern? No one answers those questions. They can't answer those questions. It's hard for them to articulate because they didn't even think about it that way. But you start sort of coming around it.
That's right.
And then you circle the drain, so to speak, and you get to it eventually. But it takes time.
And going back to the bad decision makers that we are, sometimes people have ideas or priorities that are in contravention of each other. Like I really want this and I really want that, but those two things don't actually dovetail in any kind of rational way. So then again, then you're going back to helping them articulate, well, what matters more?
Right.
You know, of this and that, which one is more important to you? And, and I've certainly in mediation, I've drawn pictures, I've made lists, we put them in different colors, it's a lot to be said for a whiteboard. But people can get to that in different ways. And as a neutral, part of the job is, again, reading that room. What's resonating with this person? Oh, the visual thing really that's going to be a good pathway. Okay, let's do colors, let's do pictures. And for the other party, it's like, pictures are stupid. We're going to caucus and you're not getting a picture.
Okay. All right, other questions or comments? Anybody online?
I have a comment. This is Kyle Beth Hilfer. It
Mhm.
seems to me one of the important distinctions between the two scenarios you presented has to do with power. And something that the mediator needs to tap into. In the first scenario, I think maybe both parties are of sort of equivalent power, based on the information that was provided to us. Whereas in the second scenario, you have
What do
the
you need, Dan?
you have the
I
XYZ.
told you she's gonna be home late. She's gonna be home about 10 to 15 minutes, she'll call.
All right.
You can eat without her. She said, make your soup.
Gotta
and
mute,
eat.
Dan, you gotta mute yourself.
You have the XYZ company, which definitely has more power.
Yes, there is
Yes.
definitely a power imbalance here.
And so the power imbalance is a crucial part of any discussion that has to happen
Yes.
right from the start. That needs to be acknowledged, I think, when you have that kind of definitive power imbalance. So I just wanted to mention that as another piece of the puzzle.
No, I think it's a great point,
Very
Kyle
good
Beth. It's, and in this particular hypothetical, right, it's not just only the sort of power imbalance of one being the employer, one being the employee, but there's also an information gap power imbalance, right?
Exactly.
Where the employer knows a lot more about why the setup is the way it is, but the employee may
Right.
not, right?
And to your point, what could ultimately come out of this is not that they hate the new position so much as they didn't like the way it was handed to them.
Right.
And that a different approach to introducing the change of role might have made all the difference.
Right.
Or not.
Can I
You know-
suggest something? Sometimes if you say, look, if you'll do this do this for us as a team player, in 2 years, we anticipate that this other position will be probably opening up because that person is likely to retire. We'd like to have you do this for us, but in 2 years, we're going to take the most serious look at you. Can't guarantee anything at any time, because 2 years is a lot of time. but that's possibly here where we might move you at some point, as long as you're working with as a team member.
That might mean a lot to Sam.
Yeah, and it also focuses on a prospective
That's right.
change that might happen in the future, conditional at best, of course, but still a prospective view as opposed to some sort of retrospective view about getting credit for what was
Right.
done or not getting credit for what was
Right.
done. something
So,
like
so
that.
moving away from rumination into prospectivity and setting goals that pull you to the future.
So let's end with
Okay, and so Winston Churchill, who was not necessarily an excellent human being, had a lot of really smart things to say. And, I think there's a lot of truth to this, particularly in the ADR space. We often have ideas of what would be a good solution. We often have ideas of what the parties need or what we think would be a good ending or what we think they should want or care about. But it's all about the listening that leads us to help parties find solutions to their conflicts.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate you making the effort to come
Thank you
down
so
here and
much.
joining us online. I'm sorry again for the technical snafus, but as I always say, as I said this to Diane earlier, technology is great.